On the night of October 15, 1952, inside the Montreal Forum, a towering Treize wrestler climbed to the top turnbuckle, leapt, and drove his knee down toward a fallen opponent. It was a move he had done 1,000 times. But this time, the man on the mat shifted, and the wrestler's shin clipped the side of his opponent's head, and a piece of the man's ear tore clean off and dropped to the canvas. It was an accident, a complete freak accident. The opponent's ears were already mangled and cauliflowered from years of abuse, and the contact was a fraction of an inch from being nothing at all. But the wrestler who threw that knee would spend the next 50 years as the most feared monster in his entire profession because of it. He would become Killer Kowalski, a name spoken in horror by millions, a man parents pointed to as the embodiment of evil. Here is the part nobody saw coming. The monster was, in real life, one of the gentlest, most disciplined, most cerebral men the business ever produced. He was a strict vegetarian for 60 years. He never drank a drop of alcohol or smoked a single cigarette. He practiced yoga, took his vitamins every day, read philosophy, wrote poetry, and carried a camera everywhere he went. He once said that no one who eats the flesh of animals can progress spiritually beyond the average. This terrifying maniac was a soft-spoken health nut who went to bed early and woke before dawn. And when his 30-year career was over, this gentle monster opened a school in a small Massachusetts town and quietly built the future of wrestling, training the man who would one day run the entire industry. So how did an accidental injury and a misprinted newspaper story turn a kind, vegetarian Canadian named Walter into Killer Kowalski, the most hated monster in wrestling, and the secret architect of its future? He was not born Killer, and he was not born Kowalski. He came into the world as Edward Waddis Spulnik on October 13, 1926, in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, the son of Polish immigrants who had crossed an ocean looking for a better life. He grew up in a hard-working, blue-collar household across the river from Detroit, and from the very start, the thing that made him stand out was simply his size. He grew and grew and grew, until he stood 6 feet 7 inches tall, a genuine giant for that era, with long limbs and a gaunt, angular frame that made him look less like a strong man and more like something out of a nightmare. But the body alone was not the gift. Plenty of tall men are clumsy. Walter was coordinated, athletic, and crucially intelligent. He had the kind of analytical mind that in another life might have made him an engineer, and in fact he worked a real job before the ring ever called him. He thought about things. He studied them. He approached his own body the way a scientist approaches an experiment. That combination, the terrifying frame and the careful mind, is the key to everything he became, because it meant he could think his way into a character far more frightening than his size alone. He took the ring name Kowalski, and in his early steward years he cycled through a series of generic, forgettable strongman gimmicks. He was billed as Tarzan. He was billed as Hercules. He was the Polish Apollo. None of it stuck because none of it was him. He learned the trade from one of the most legitimately dangerous men in the history of the sport, the great Lou Thesz, a genuine shooter and multiple-time world champion who could stretch a man into submission for real. To learn under Thesz was to learn from the gold standard, the man who represented everything legitimate and rugged about old-school wrestling. And it gave Kowalski a foundation of real, credible toughness beneath the theatrics. Trained by a wrestling god, blessed with a monster's body and a thinker's brain, Walter Kowalski broke into the business in 1947 and went looking for the thing that would make him unforgettable. He had no idea it would find him by pure accident on a Wednesday night in Montreal. For the first several years of his career, Walter Kowalski was a good big man and nothing more. He toured the territories that carved up North American wrestling in that era, a reliable, imposing heavyweight who could draw a little heat and put on a decent match. He developed a signature, a flying knee drop, where he would climb the turnbuckle and launch his considerable bulk down onto a prone opponent, dropping his knee across the chest or the head. It was dramatic, it was visual, it made the crowd gasp. And it was about to define his entire life. He was big, he was competent, and he was anonymous. In a business full of giants and strongmen and masked villains, there was nothing yet to separate Kowalski from 100 other large men working the circuit. He needed an identity, a hook, the one thing that would make a promoter put his name at the top of the card and make a fan remember it on the drive home. Some wrestlers spend their whole careers searching for that hook and never find it. They are talented, they are reliable, they are forgotten, drifting from territory to territory as the years pile up, always the supporting act, never the reason anyone bought a ticket. Kowalski was on exactly that road, a good big man slowly running out of road, and he knew it. Kowalski's hook came looking for him, and it arrived disguised as a catastrophe. His frequent opponent in the Montreal territory was a barrel-chested, bearded brawler billed as Yukon Eric, a hugely popular strongman whose ears, after years in the ring, had swollen and hardened into the lumpy scarred mass that wrestlers and boxers call cauliflower ear. Eric's ears were already half ruined, fragile, packed with damaged cartilage. The two men had a good money-drawing rivalry, the kind of reliable feud that fills buildings. Night after night, they collided. And one of those nights, Kowalski climbed the turnbuckle to deliver the knee drop that had become his trademark. The same move, the same leap, the same descent he had performed without incident hundreds of times before. This time, fate was waiting on the canvas. As Kowalski came down, Yukon Eric moved, just slightly, just enough. Instead of catching Eric flush across the body, Kowalski's shin bone glanced off the side of Eric's head, and the brittle, overworked cartilage of that cauliflowered ear simply gave way. A chunk of it tore loose and fell to the mat in front of a packed, screaming house at the Montreal Forum. The arena erupted in horror. To the thousands of fans watching, it did not look like an accident. It looked like a monster had deliberately, gleefully torn the ear off another human being. They began screaming at him. Maniac, killer. The names rained down. And in that instant, an ordinary big man became something the business had rarely seen. A genuine object of terror. What happened next sealed it forever, and it is one of the great ironies in the history of the sport. Kowalski, shaken and feeling terrible, went to the hospital to check on Eric. When he walked into the room and saw his old opponent sitting up in bed with his head wrapped in an enormous, comical bandage, Kowalski's first thought, by his own account years later, was that Eric looked exactly like Humpty Dumpty sitting on a wall. He couldn't help it. He started to laugh. And Yukon Eric, seeing the absurdity of it, started laughing too. It was a moment of shared, nervous human relief between two colleagues. But the next morning, the newspaper got the story wrong. Whether by mistake or by instinct, for a better headline. The papers reported that the heartless Kowalski had shown up at the hospital and laughed at his maimed victim cruelly to his face. That single misprinted detail did what no promoter, no gimmick, no carefully booked storyline ever could. It transformed a freak accident into the origin story of a monster. Overnight, Walter Kowalski was reborn as Killer Kowalski, the man who ripped off an ear and laughed about it. The grudge with Yukon Eric exploded into a series of vicious rematches that drew enormous crowds across the continent. The hook had found him, and here was the wall he now faced. He was branded forever. The question was whether he could turn one accidental night into a 30-year career, or whether the world would forget him the moment the shock wore off. Plenty of wrestlers have stumbled into a single viral moment and watched it fade within months, unable to build anything lasting on top of it. A reputation handed to you by an accident is a fragile thing. It can vanish as quickly as it appeared. Kowalski now had to prove that the monster was more than one terrible, lucky night. He did not let it wear off. Instead, Walter Kowalski made a cold, brilliant decision. If the world wanted a monster, he would give them the most complete, most committed, most terrifying monster they had ever seen. This is where the thinker's mind took over. Kowalski studied his own gift for fear the way he studied everything else. He understood that his gaunt, towering, hollow-cheeked frame was an asset, that he looked genuinely unwell, genuinely dangerous, genuinely capable of anything. So he played into it. He moved with a slow, deliberate menace. He fixed opponents with a wild, unblinking stare. He developed a finishing hold called the claw, clamping his enormous hand around an opponent's midsection or skull and squeezing until they writhed and surrendered, a move that looked like it could crush bone. He turned the accidental savagery of the ear into a permanent promise. Get in the ring with Killer Kowalski, and you might not come out whole. And he took this act around the world. Kowalski was not a regional attraction. He was a global one, drawing heat and money in Canada, across the United States, in Australia, in Japan, in Europe. Everywhere he went, the formula worked, because fear is a universal language, and Kowalski spoke it fluently. He became one of the most reliable box office villains on the planet, a man promoters could import into any territory to give the local hero a monster worth conquering. He understood that he was a kind of traveling weapon, a guaranteed source of heat that could revive a sagging territory or make a new hero overnight, simply by being defeated. A young babyface who could survive Killer Kowalski instantly became a star. And Kowalski knew it, and he gave that gift to opponent after opponent without ever breaking the illusion of the monster. He even became a maker of other monsters. When a young, almost unknown giant named Andre was being introduced to North American audiences, it was Kowalski he was matched against in a Battle of the Giants, and photographs of Andre towering over the already famous Kowalski helped establish Andre's legend in the wrestling magazines. Think about that exchange. Kowalski was so established, so recognizable as the measuring stick of frightening size, that simply standing next to him made an unknown giant look like a phenomenon. Kowalski did much the same favor in Japan for the great giant Barber, helping to build a national hero in a televised match. The most feared man in the business was, quietly, generous enough to use his own hard-won reputation to build up the next generation of stars. It was the first hint of the teacher he would one day become, the first sign that beneath the monster was a man who cared more about the business than about his own ego. To understand Kowalski at his peak, you have to understand the hero he spent years trying to destroy, because a monster is only as great as the champion he threatens. That champion was Bruno Sammartino, the Italian Superman, the most beloved wrestler in the world during the 1960s and 70s, and the longest reigning champion in the history of the company that would become WWE. Bruno was a genuine folk hero to millions of working-class and immigrant fans, a powerful, honorable strongman who had survived a war as a child and built himself into an icon. He was the people's protector, and the most dangerous, most credible threat to his throne, for years, was Killer Kowalski. This was the matchup that sold out arena after arena up and down the entire eastern seaboard. The beloved, muscular hero against the gaunt, towering monster. Bruno's fans did not merely want him to win, they needed him to, because Kowalski represented something that genuinely frightened them. Picture one of those Madison Square Garden nights. The arena is a wall of noise. Bruno, the hero, has the monster reeling, the crowd on its feet, sensing the kill. And then Kowalski's enormous hand shoots out and clamps onto Bruno's midsection. The claw, the fingers digging in, and the champion's face contorts in agony, and he sinks slowly to one knee. The roar turns to a scream of pure dread, 18,000 people willing their hero to escape a hold that looks like it is crushing the life out of him. That image, the people's champion brought to his knees by the monster's grip, is what filled those buildings again and again, because the audience could never quite be sure the hero would get up. Twice, the two collided in the main event of Madison Square Garden, the most famous arena in the world, and twice they fought to a no decision, the monster proving so formidable that the hero could not put him away. Promoters could run that match again and again in city after city, because the fear never faded. Even at the age of 50, in 1974, Kowalski was still considered a credible enough threat to challenge Bruno for the championship one last time. Few villains in history have stayed dangerous for so long, and the breadth of his peak is staggering when you lay it out. He held championships across multiple continents and promotions, a world title in one organization 5 separate times, regional and international crowns by the dozen. In 1976, masked and billed as one of the executioners alongside the enormous Big John Studd, he captured the World Tag Team Championship of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. He was so feared and so respected as an in-ring force that he was the man other wrestlers were genuinely nervous to face. A heavyweight who, by some accounts, once broke the leg of the strutting NWA World Champion Buddy Rogers in a Montreal ring, just as he had once, by accident, taken Yukon Eric's ear. There was always that whisper around him that the monster might not be entirely an act, that a man who looked that dangerous and moved that deliberately might actually be capable of the things his character promised. That whisper was worth more than any belt, because it meant that every time he stepped through the ropes, a small, real part of the audience, and maybe of his opponent, wondered what he might do. Picture what he was, at the height of it. A 6'7" spectre in black, stalking toward the ring in arena after arena in country after country, while the crowd roared its hatred and a beloved hero waited, frightened, in the opposite corner. For 3 decades, Walter Kowalski was the nightmare the business needed, the villain so convincing that fans forgot he was performing at all. He never wore the top world championship of the biggest companies. He never needed to. His value was not in holding the belt. His value was in being the most terrifying reason the hero had to fight for it. And the truly remarkable thing, the secret at the heart of all that terror, was that none of it was real. The most frightening man in wrestling was when the bell rang and the lights went down, the calmest, kindest soul in the building. Slow down here, because this is the twist that makes Walter Kowalski one of the most fascinating men the sport ever produced. Everything the public believed about him was an illusion built on a single accident and a single misprint. The real Walter Kowalski was, by every account of everyone who actually knew him, a gentle, thoughtful, deeply spiritual man. He had been a strict vegetarian for 60 years, decades before it was fashionable, at a time when a giant athlete refusing to eat meat was almost unheard of. He believed, sincerely, that eating animals held a person back spiritually, and he lived by that conviction every day of his life. He never drank alcohol. He never smoked. He took his vitamins religiously, practiced yoga, and lived by a simple personal motto: early to bed and early to rise. He was also an artist and an intellectual. He carried a camera everywhere and became a genuinely skilled photographer, documenting the strange traveling world of professional wrestling from the inside. He wrote poetry. He read philosophy. He was, by the testimony of the men who shared locker rooms with him for 30 years, one of the most articulate, most intelligent, most genuinely kind people in the entire business. The Boston newspapers, when he died, did not call him a monster. They called him the Gentle Killer, and wrote about a legacy of love. Think about the strange weight of that life. Imagine being one of the kindest, most disciplined men in your profession, and spending 30 years being hated by millions of strangers as a maniac who maimed people for fun. Imagine signing up, night after night, to be the thing parents warned their children about, knowing all the while that the real you was a vegetarian poet who went to bed early and wouldn't hurt a soul on purpose. Kowalski carried that contradiction with a grace that says everything about who he actually was. He understood that the monster was a gift the public had given him by mistake, and he honored it by playing it to perfection, and then he went home and was Walter. There was no bitterness in him about it. No sense that the world had wronged him by misunderstanding who he really was. He seemed to grasp something most performers never do: that the character and the man are allowed to be different, that you can give an audience the nightmare they paid for and still go to sleep at peace with yourself. The accident made the legend, but it never, not for one day, changed the man. When Kowalski finally retired from the ring in 1977, after 30 years as wrestling's most reliable nightmare, he did not fade into the quiet retirement his gentle nature might have suggested. Instead, the monster became a teacher, and in doing so, he built a legacy far larger than any championship. In a small town in Massachusetts, Walter Kowalski opened a professional wrestling school, the Killer Kowalski Institute of Professional Wrestling. And here, the gentle, disciplined, analytical man who had been hiding behind the monster all those years finally got to be himself in public. He poured his decades of knowledge, his obsession with fundamentals, his patience, and his kindness into hundreds of hopeful young students. For roughly 25 years, he ran that school, and it became known across the industry as one of the great places to learn the craft, a doorway into the business. And the teaching reflected the real man, not the monster, by every account of those who trained under him. Kowalski was demanding but generous, a stickler for the basics who believed that character and psychology mattered as much as any move, who drilled his students on the fundamentals until the fundamentals became instinct. He was not interested in creating copies of Killer Kowalski. He was interested in giving each student the tools to find their own identity, the way he had spent years searching for his. The same analytical mind that had engineered the most convincing monster in wrestling now engineered careers, one patient lesson at a time. The students who walked through that door changed wrestling forever. He trained the powerful, charismatic Joni Laura, who became Chyna, one of the most groundbreaking female stars in history. He trained Perry Saturn and a long line of others who would go on to careers in the biggest companies in the world. But the crown jewel, the student who validated everything Kowalski had built, was a tall, driven young man named Paul Levesque, who would become Triple H, a multiple-time world champion, the husband of the boss's daughter, and eventually one of the most powerful executives in the entire industry, the man steering the creative direction of WWE itself. The single most important architect of modern wrestling learned how to wrestle in Killer Kowalski's school. Every decision shaping the business today flows, in part, from lessons a gentle giant taught in a small New England gym, and the circle closed beautifully. When Walter Kowalski was inducted into the Hall of Fame, the honor of presenting him went to his own most famous student, Triple H, the pupil inducting the master. Kowalski sold the school as his health began to decline, and on August 30th, 2008, after suffering a heart attack and spending his final days on life support, the gentle killer passed away at the age of 81, survived by his wife. He had given the business 30 years as its greatest monster, and then given it its future. Strip away the claw and the knee drop and the screaming arenas, and look at what actually happened here. A thoughtful, gentle, vegetarian giant from a Polish immigrant family in Windsor, Ontario, spent years as a competent, anonymous big man, searching for the thing that would make him matter. He never found it. It found him, in the cruelest, most random way imaginable, in the form of an accident that tore a man's ear and a newspaper that told the story wrong. And rather than run from that monstrous reputation, Walter Kowalski did something that took genuine brilliance. He understood the gift inside the disaster, and he played the monster better and longer, and more convincingly than anyone before him. For 30 years, across the entire world, all while remaining, privately, one of the kindest men anyone in the business ever met. Then he did the thing that truly sets him apart. He took everything the monster had taught him, all that discipline and intelligence and patience, and he gave it away. He spent his final decades not chasing one more match or one more payday, but teaching, building, lifting up the next generation, including the very man who would grow up to run the whole industry. The accident made him a legend, but the teaching made him immortal, in a way no single match ever could. There are wrestlers all over the world today, and in the highest offices of the business, who can trace their craft directly back to a gentle giant in a small Massachusetts gym. That is the real Killer Kowalski, not a maniac who maimed a man for fun. A kind, brilliant soul who got handed a monster by accident, wore it like a master, and then quietly built the future when the show was over. So where does he actually rank? And you have to be honest, because the case for Kowalski is unusual, and it does not run through championships. If the question is who was the greatest champion, Kowalski is not the answer, and it is not close. He never held the top world title of the major companies. He was the great challenger, the unforgettable threat, the monster the hero had to overcome. But the belt itself almost always eluded him. His own trainer, Lou Thesz, was a far more legitimate and decorated wrestler. Bruno Sammartino, the man he chased for years, wore the crown that Kowalski never did. And his single most famous moment, the thing his entire legend is built on, was not a masterpiece of skill or strategy. It was an accident, amplified by a printing error. By the cold metrics of titles won, plenty of men rank above him. But change the question, and Kowalski's case becomes extraordinary. Ask who was one of the greatest, most enduring, most genuinely frightening villains the business ever produced. And he is on the shortest of short lists. A monster who stayed credible and bankable for an almost unheard of 30 years. On multiple continents. Ask who helped build the legends of others, and you find him elevating Andre the Giant and Giant Baba with his own reputation. And then ask the question that truly separates him from everyone. Who, after their career ended, personally trained the people who would carry the entire industry forward? Almost no great wrestler can answer that. Kowalski can. The man who runs the creative heart of modern WWE learned his craft in Kowalski's ring. That is a kind of greatness that has nothing to do with belts. So how good was he actually? As a champion, he was not one, and that is a real limit. But as a villain, as a draw, as a craftsman of fear, he ranks among the very best who ever lived. And as a teacher, as a builder of others, he may stand nearly alone. The honest verdict fits a gentle man who was handed a monster by accident. Killer Kowalski never wore the biggest crown, and his legend began with a freak injury and a lie. But he turned that accident into 30 years of greatness, and then turned his retirement into the foundation of wrestling's future. The accident made the monster. The man made the legends. A gentle vegetarian who wrote poetry and went to bed early, spent 30 years as the most feared monster on earth because of one accidental knee drop and one wrong headline, and then spent his retirement quietly building the men who would inherit the whole business. But the man who trained that monster, the shooter who taught Walter Kowalski how to wrestle, was something else entirely. A 6-time world champion and a legitimately dangerous fighter, who represented everything real and rugged about the old school. The man other wrestlers were genuinely afraid to anger. Next time we tell the story of Lou Thesz, the last true wrestling god, the man who could have hurt anyone he wanted and almost never did, and the standard of legitimacy that nearly every champion of his century was quietly measured against.